Hey everyone, I'm Megyn Kelly. Welcome to the Megyn Kelly Show. No drama in my voice today because I cannot use any of my normal intonations. Just hanging on. I've started a steroid and I have these trusty little watermelon drops, which are very tasty, I have to say. Ludens, if you're wondering. So bear with me because we actually do have a ton of real news breaking today. So honestly, I considered not coming yesterday. My voice is really starting to go. There's too much news. I have to be here, and I am here. And let's do this thing. Quite a turn of events regarding the Washington Post's big story on Friday that Secretary of War Pete Hegseth allegedly ordered military leaders to, quote, kill everybody after two people aboard an alleged drug boat survived the initial attack. Okay, now this is the Washington Post. It broke on Friday. That was its reporting. It set the country on fire for the past 5 days, with people repeating that story, accusing Pete Hegseth of war crimes, and has dominated print media, digital media, and everything online, everything on cable. The New York Times late last night reporting, citing 5 U.S. officials, that basically the Washington Post story was all wrong. That Secretary Hegseth's initial order did not, in fact, specify what should happen if survivors remained. And as White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt laid out yesterday, the second attack was ordered independently by Admiral Frank Bradley, goes by Mitch, I guess, in order to render the vessel destroyed and complete the mission. We pointed this out in the AM update this morning, and our first guest is going to walk us through it. There is a difference between a mission that is meant to destroy a boat that winds up simply damaging it on the first strike, and one that destroys it on the first strike, but nonetheless has 2 people floating in the water. If the boat has not been destroyed and it's merely damaged, that's an incomplete mission, whether there are survivors floating or not. The Times also dropping the bombshell that, per one of the officials they interviewed, the U.S. military actually intercepted radio communications from one of the survivors in the water to narco-traffickers. Yet another reason why it might make sense for the mainstream media to just pump the brakes before they climb all over the terms war crimes and start talking about prosecuting people for murder. My first guest today already knows that lesson because he was one of the few online who was saying, hold on, over the past couple of days, that he did not see the evidence of any war crime. And after he read the Washington Post report, even though now we believe it was erroneous, but even as flawed as it was, he said there's reason in here to doubt what they're reporting, even from what they've said. And his name is Dr. Brian L. Cox. He spent 22 years in the U.S. Army. He's now an adjunct professor at Cornell Law School. His work focuses on international criminal law involving armed conflict. Brian has gone viral on X for his analysis on what happened in this strike, taking on the misleading reporting by the Washington Post and what he says are biased takes from anonymous military groups that are now getting re-cited by places like the Washington Post to shore up their initial reporting. These are anonymous people who are saying, here's what the law is. How do we rely on them for anything? Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's really great to join you.
Okay, so you teach law and you have a background in the military. Did you practice law?
I did. So my first 15 years in the military was as a combat soldier, so airborne infantry soldier, and then combat camera, and then as an airborne infantry officer. So that was 15 years on the line, as we call it in the military. And then the last 3 of that 15 years, I was in law school while I was in the National Guard. And then once I graduated, I came back from law school, came back on active duty as a judge advocate. And I spent the last 7 years as a military lawyer, so an Army judge advocate, including a deployment to Afghanistan, where I advised on international operational law.
Okay, so quite a bit. So you read this Washington Post report that hit on Friday, the headline of which is, hold on, Hegseth order on first Caribbean boat strike. Officials say, kill them all.
Yeah.
The subhead, as 2 men clung to a stricken, burning ship targeted by SEAL Team 6, the Joint Special Operations Commander followed the Defense Secretary's order to leave no survivors. Now we have the New York Times weighing in, saying basically that this was wrong, that there was one order by Pete Hegseth. It was before the mission and said, take out these boats. And there was no order saying kill them all.
Right.
But he wanted these boats destroyed. And that there was no subsequent communication between Pete Hegseth and the admiral who was on scene making the calls saying, kill those survivors who were clinging for life to this partially destroyed boat. That is not what happened, according to 5 sources in the New York Times. We'll see what the Washington Post does. But you, before you even knew about the New York Times reporting, were saying there are enough holes in that WAPO report to drive a truck through. I do not trust this, and I actually don't think any war crime has been stated. Why?
So there's just so much speculation that's going on. So we don't know. It was 2 anonymous sources who were reporting, the quote from Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. And we don't know for sure. Well, first of all, they're anonymous reports, anonymous sources. So there's that. But even the quote from the story, it's not clear whether this was a direct quote from, Pete Hegseth saying "kill everybody," the way that it's worded in the Washington Post story, or whether the anonymous sources are basically paraphrasing what Secretary of War told to whoever the audience was. And so that was the first element that I'm concerned about. And then even if, let's say, it was directly before the mission and the Secretary of War directs, whatever the commander is involved to kill everybody, that still isn't necessarily in order to take no prisoners, right? And so we are trained that if somebody is out of the fight due to sickness, illness, injury, or detention, in this case, shipwreck, that we don't continue the attack. And so if troops are given an order to kill everybody, you can reasonably interpret that to be kill all the enemy, attack the enemy. But at the same time, if you do end up encountering someone who is out of the fight, in this case due to shipwreck, then you don't attack them.
Exactly. So what the New York Times is reporting today, it hit last night, is that, again, 5 U.S. officials who spoke separately on the condition of anonymity said Mr. Hegseth, ahead of the September 2nd attack, ordered a strike that would kill the people on board the boat and destroy the vessel and its purported cargo of drugs, which would be a standard order. Yeah. I mean, you don't order these boats destroyed and not expect the people on board are going to die. You just take them out, take out the boat, take out the drug cargo on board. And that was it. Exactly. Not what the Washington Post reported, which was as these 2 survivors are clinging there, Pete Hegseth called up and said, take them out. Right. That's what the Washington Post went with. It's what NPR is going with still today, even in the wake of late night's New York Times drop.
Yeah, and it's just completely speculative. And, I understand the need to rely on anonymous sources at times when we're reporting, stories, especially when we're dealing with the government. But we still need to assess, we need to engage in a bit of media literacy and say, okay, well, these anonymous sources are saying that Pete Hegseth said this. And there's just so much, ambiguity there, which, ambiguity is fine. We're going to have that in reporting, but then to take that and run with it and essentially accuse the sitting Secretary of War of being a war criminal based on, this basically double hearsay that's being reported from anonymous sources is just, it doesn't make any rational sense.
Well, and on top of everything, so now you tell me, let's deal with what we believe is the reality here. Because WAPO suggested that Hegseth gave a spoken order, saying, kill them all, kill everyone who is still in that water. Now we believe that's not true, that the Washington Post had that wrong. So let's deal with what we believe actually happened. Pete gave the okay for the mission, take out the boat, strike it, everybody on board is going to die, and take out the cargo. Then they dropped their first strike. Right. And the boat was, according to the administration's critics, they say it was destroyed. Excuse me, it was destroyed. And you have these 2 clinging to life. And the rules of law prohibit you from striking them. Now let's talk about the admiral, because the admiral, this guy Mitch, forgive me, can't find his last name in front of me. He did say, Bradley,
Yep.
let's have a second strike.
Right.
He is the one who said, we need a second strike. But that too is not a war crime, because you point out in your piece the difference between destroying a boat and damaging a boat.
Right.
Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So assuming that the boat itself originally is a military objective. So by definition, in the law of armed conflict, this is something that's by its nature, location, purpose, or use, in this case, purpose, makes an effective contribution to military action, such that capturing it or destroying it gives a definite military advantage, concrete direct military advantage under the circumstances ruling at the time. So that's the standard. That's what we apply in practice. That's what we're trained on. And so the boats, to begin with, assuming that law of armed conflict applies, and there's a lot of discussion about whether it should or shouldn't, and that's something we can get into. But for purposes of the operators who are involved in this strike, they are applying the law of armed conflict because they're told that they're in an armed conflict. So this boat originally qualifies then as a military objective by definition that I just suggested, and it will no longer be a military objective if it is completely destroyed, right? So if under the circumstances no longer by its use makes an effective contribution. And even with the facts that the Washington Post it reports in that initial story, there's an indication to me, at least when I read this, that the commander involved must have assessed that it's still qualified, to use the legal term, still qualified as a military objective, because he suggested that it could still radio for assistance, and another boat could come and capture, regain control of the cargo, and then continue mission. Almost said Charlie Mike, because that's what we call it in the military. Continue mission. And so if that's the case, then it's my impression from reading that is that the commander must have assessed that this boat still qualifies as a military objective such that it can still be attacked, which would also mean, incidentally, that the personnel that are on board are not shipwrecked, because, and if they were shipwrecked, let's call them hors de combat, so out of the fight due to the shipwreck. So we should not attack them in that case. But if the vessel that they're on still qualifies as a military objective, then they're not, but they're by definition, they're not shipwrecked. And, the commander could order subsequent strikes to finish the mission, to complete the mission, to ensure that the boat is no longer serviceable, that no longer is a military objective.
So if the boat is not destroyed and the mission is to destroy it,
yeah,
and you have two survivors who are floating on the boat or holding onto the boat in the water,
yeah,
it's fair game. They're going to go if the mission is take out that boat.
That's right. So this is a difference between whether the boat was disabled or destroyed. And so if it's destroyed, we can think of pieces of boat floating around in the water, and maybe survivors with a life vest on or clinging to it or whatever. Like, that's a destroyed boat. And if that's the case, then there would be no reason to reattack it. But if the boat is disabled, and again, by the initial report from the Washington Post, it's what it sounds to me like the commander involved assessed that the boat was disabled rather than destroyed, then it still qualifies then by legal definition, by the law of armed conflict, as a military objective, such that it can be it can be attacked until
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The mission is destroy it.
Yeah.
You've only disabled it,
right.
So you need a second strike to destroy it. That's what this Admiral Bradley saw and did. And those two guys who survived the initial blast were taken down in the second strike. And now, not only did we have the suggestion that it's possible the two survivors might have been able to coordinate with other narco-terrorists, we actually, in the New York Times report, this is on the record now. One of the officials that spoke to the Times is quoted as saying the U.S. military intercepted radio communications from one of the survivors to what the official said were narco traffickers.
Right.
Now that's as clear cut as it comes. Any military commander would order those guys taken out.
Absolutely, because at that point, if that's the intelligence that they have, at that point it absolutely still does qualify. Because again, by definition, an object that by its use makes an effective contribution to military action. And so, so it it was kind of implied by the way that the Washington Post reported it that, the commander believed that they could radio for assistance and have someone come and get it, the cargo and continue with the mission. But with with going on record now, establishing on the record that yes, there was in fact a radio transmission that was intercepted, then that basically supports the conclusion that that's exactly what the commander believed at the time, and the commander ordered subsequent strikes to destroy the boat because it wasn't destroyed to begin with.
This is so amazing to me. This all makes perfect sense. It's a left-wing Trump-hating narrative that we have these military commanders who are just these rogue agents who have thrown caution to the wind, who are just out there for bloodlust, trying to take down anybody that they see in the seas, as opposed to rational, thoughtful, considered leaders who understand the rules of military combat a lot better than the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Or some armchair pundits who want to jump all over them. And it also seemed clear in the way the military was very careful in its wording about this. You had Trump saying, Hegseth told me he did not give that second order, that he did not give a verbal command to kill all the people. And they're still denying that. And then Hegseth sent out a tweet saying, I stand behind Admiral Bradley. He's done nothing wrong, which seemed to be a way of saying, here's the guy who gave the order, but he did nothing wrong. It was a way of sort of clarifying it wasn't me, and now we know it wasn't him. But we also want to find out whether Admiral Bradley did anything wrong, and the answer is no. He had a partially destroyed ship from which, according to this one official to the Times, the radio comms were still possible, and one of the survivors was using them to call in backup.
Exactly. Yeah, and so this is the danger with running with completely speculative reporting. Is and initial reports are almost always, and this is something we know in the military, for operationally we just take it as a given. Initial reports are almost always, if not wrong, they're at least incomplete enough that you don't have enough information to make kind of really meaningful conclusions. We still need to gather information. We still need to figure out exactly what happened. And so the responsible thing, if the Washington Post wanted to report, based on the sources that they have, I mean, that's a journalistic decision in-house. And, I know that there are checks in place to decide, whether we're going to run a story based on completely anonymous sources. So that's one thing to run this story. There is news value and public interest in it. I get it. But we need to exercise caution when all we're dealing with is speculative reports from anonymous sources that we're not really sure, like they're providing some evidence of what happened, but they're not really filling in the gaps. And before we can make conclusions and denounce everybody involved as a war criminal, I mean, this is, if they're wrong about this, if they're wrong about the allegations, this is defamation, right? So it's
pretty mighty slander.
Right. So before we jump to conclusions like this, it makes logical sense to gather the information, figure out, now if it came to light that the commander involved or the Secretary of War, for this case, saw that the boat was completely destroyed and there was no military utility in attacking the boat anyways, and there's just two survivors clinging around to, wreckage floating around in the Caribbean Ocean, and they said killed him anyways. I mean, if that's the evidence that we're getting, then, I mean, that sounds to me like a war crime, right? But we're not getting that evidence from the initial Washington Post report. And so it's irresponsible to make conclusions, really assertive conclusions that this was a war crime and that Pete Hegseth needs to resign or be fired or prosecuted or whatever, based on incomplete information.
You had Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts out there saying, you mark my words, someone's going to jail for murder.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like so irresponsible, ginning up hatred and acrimony toward our serving military members who are under enough stress as it is. You made a point in your tweet storm that was so powerful, responding to those who say, in defense of this so-called seditious six, the six lawmakers who went out there and started this whole thing by saying, hey, soldiers, don't obey illegal orders. People say, you know what? It's just a reminder to these soldiers in these tumultuous times, like you don't have the obligation to follow an illegal order, and they just needed that. what you had a response to that? Tell us what it is.
Yeah, we don't need to be so having spent 22 years in the military, I'm just still kind of part of my identity, and so I still identify in that even though I'm no longer in. But service members, me included when I was in, we don't need reminders that we have to we have an obligation not to obey manifestly unlawful orders, right? So not just unlawful orders, but manifestly. We don't need anyone from Congress. We don't need anyone from the outside to remind us of this because, I mean, it's part of the ethos that we live every day. It's drilled into us, starting in basic training, and it's part of our following orders. It's part of the military life. I mean, it's part of good order and discipline. But we already understand that we have no obligation to follow manifestly unlawful orders. And so the people who are reminding us or reminding the members of the DoD of this, they know that service members don't need to be reminded that we have no obligation to follow manifestly unlawful orders. They're doing this to create doubt, to second guess the current political leadership of the military, civilian and senior military leadership, to create the appearance that the orders that are being given are manifestly unlawful, and so there is an obligation not to follow them. And that is also irresponsible because, again, it's not something we need to be reminded of, and the obligation is not just to not follow or not obey unlawful orders, but it's manifestly unlawful. And if we don't and so the context of the people, the members of Congress who are being referred to as the seditious six, they're making their case that this is not an armed conflict, that it should actually be, human rights law that's applying, and we should not be engaged in, military strikes against these boats. And that's an opinion, and that's, it's interesting academically. But the troops who are involved in this conflict are not specialists in, international law involving the resort to force. And so, that's at the political leadership level. And so, we are given orders. We have determined, the political leadership has determined that you are in an armed conflict. So apply law of armed conflict to this rather than, human rights law. And that is we're not in a position to understand whether that is unlawful or not. We are going to comply with law of armed conflict.
This is pretty sophisticated stuff that had to be run up and down the chain of command and lawyers, DOJ and elsewhere. Like, to expect Admiral Bradley to have full, complete knowledge of this, whereas people who have gone to law school, who have practiced law at the elite levels, who understand military law, maritime law, all the things. They had to study this. They had teams who studied it. To expect one admiral to have it all down, as opposed to understanding that I have a boss who has to deal with that. He talks to lawyers who've had to deal with that. And when my boss tells me what to do, I do it.
That's right.
Like, that's how the chain of command works. But the notion that Senator Mark Kelly can somehow empower, the guy who actually has to press the button on the kinetic strike, to say, no, Admiral, I'm not doing that, sir. Mark Kelly told me I have the authority to say no to you, is really dangerous.
It is. So it's dangerous at the individual level, because if that troop, whoever it is, that service member refuses to obey the order, and it doesn't turn out that it's reasonably manifestly unlawful, then that whoever it is, that service member, is going to be court-martialed. And that service member, it's not going to be a defense that, well, I read on, social media that Senator Mark Kelly said that I have an obligation not to do this, and so I didn't do it, right? So that's not a defense. Right. And so that service member is at legal risk for having the impression that he or she does not need to follow this order when it actually is a lawful order. And so these external commentators are essentially trying to substitute their own understanding of what is or is not lawful for the actual current chain of command from the Secretary of War all the way down to the tactical level. So that's one issue for the individual concerned, is that's not going to be a defense when they get court-martialed for this. But then there's a more kind of systemic concern with this, and that is it's sowing the seeds of doubt among those who are actually involved with carrying out orders And if there is hesitation in carrying out lawful orders, then that's the whole reason why we train on this. We train on the disciplined use of overwhelming force. If we're not doing that because we're second guessing orders that are actually lawful, we're going to end up having hesitation on the battlefield, and that's going to end up creating missed opportunities that could end up costing us our lives when the missed opportunity of the adversary that we didn't attack ends up attacking us, and that could end up creating a risk of mission failure.
Wow, it's just so irresponsible. Brian Cox, thank you so much for your analysis. Love talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. All right, take care.
Thank you for your service.
Indeed.
Okay, coming up next, Rich and Charlie have been watching this. They're with National Review. We are having National Review Day, and we start that in 2 minutes.